everyone, to today's Pineapple Support webinar on radical value-based communication. Communication, the root of both interpersonal and occupational connection and conflict. This webinar will explore effective communication styles that will allow you to engage in value-based interactions with others, as well as tangible strategies to begin incorporating them into your daily life. Today's webinar is presented by myself, Dr. Tess Kilwei, and sponsored by SegPay. Let's get started. Before we get too deep, let's talk about why communication is important to talk about in this space at all. The adult entertainment industry is dynamic and intimate and requires effective communication in both personal and professional spheres. Personally, it requires the use of healthy communication styles to provide feedback and ask for what we need with our partners, our friends, and our family. Professionally, communication can require negotiation, understanding subtle cues from others, and maintaining intimate connections. Above all, mutual respect is created and maintained when communication is clear, direct, and assertive. However, we're going to talk about a variety of communication styles that show up in both personal and professional spaces throughout today's webinar. There are 5 primary communication styles. As you can see on the slide here, starting with passive. Our passive communicators are often indirect, people-pleasing, apologetic, and can be overlooked. They may say things like, "I don't care either way," when they really do, or "never mind," when they actually have more to say. The second communication styles are aggressive communicators. These folks are often direct, expressive, dominant, and sometimes controlling. They may say things like, "I don't agree with you, and that's that," or "I don't care what you have to say." Next, our passive-aggressive communicators are indirect, sarcastic, dishonest, and often self-enhancing. They may say things like, "I'm not mad, but whatever," or "it doesn't matter anyways." Our assertive communicators are direct, confident, expressive, and typically empathetic. They may say things like, "I think we should consider this option as well," or "I have to disagree, and let me explain why." Finally, our manipulative communicators are direct, deceitful, determined, and typically insincere. They may say things like, "You're being too emotional," or "I never said that," when they really did. Now, people typically engage in a combination of communication styles depending upon the setting, the situation, and who's involved. But what we want to do is focus most on the assertive communication style as a healthy and productive style that we want to strive for. Assertive communication is the ideal communication style because what it does is promote and encourage respect for both yourself and others. It allows you to express your thoughts and feelings directly and calmly. It also allows for collaboration with others and typically makes others feel more comfortable communicating with you. It can involve planning of what you're going to say, and yes, also means saying no when you need to and when you mean it. The goals to keep in mind when you're striving for assertive communication is giving yourself time to think of what you want to say, not being dismissive of other parties involved, and keeping things collaborative and non-judgmental. Now, while assertive communication is the ideal style, it can be difficult in the midst of disagreements with others. It's important to note that while every relationship, personal or professional, has disagreements, it's how we handle these disagreements that really count. This is where fair fighting rules on the slide come in. So these rules don't tell us that we can't argue or disagree with others, but instead they tell us how to do that safely and respectfully. These rules come from therapistaid.com, which is a great resource for free worksheets, videos, and articles on mental health topics. So rule number 1, before you begin the conversation, ask yourself why you feel upset. Are you angry because your partner left the dishes in the sink? Or are you angry because you feel like you're doing an uneven share of the housework and this is just one more piece of evidence? think about feelings before starting the conversation at all. Next, discuss one topic at a time. Don't let "you left the dishes in the sink" turn into "you watch too much TV" or "you smoke too much weed." Discussions that get off topic are more likely to get heated and less likely to solve the original problem. So choose one topic and stick to it. Third, and importantly, don't use degrading language. Discuss the issue at hand and not the person. So no put downs, swearing, or name calling. Degrading language is an attempt to express negative feelings while making sure the other person feels just as bad. And doing so typically leads to character attacks while the original issue, the original thing you're upset about, is forgotten. Number 4, express your feelings with words. For example, "I feel hurt when you ignore my phone calls." "I feel scared when you yell." Structure your sentences as I statements. So I feel emotion when event. This can help you express how you feel while taking responsibility for your own emotions. However, starting with "I" does not give a license to ignore the other fighting rules that we're talking about. Number 5, take turns speaking. Give your full attention while the other person speaks. To the best that you can, avoid making corrections or thinking about what you want to say. Your only job is to understand their point of view, even if you disagree. If you personally find it difficult to not interrupt, try setting a timer and allowing 1 to 2 minutes for each person to speak without interruption. Now, when taking turns speaking, it's important to avoid stonewalling. So sometimes the easiest way to respond to an argument is to retreat into your shell and refuse to speak at all. This is what we call stonewalling. You might feel better temporarily, but the original issue will remain unresolved, and the other person will likely feel more upset or dismissed. If you absolutely cannot go on, tell the other person you need to take a timeout and agree to resume the discussion later when it feels appropriate. Just as important is avoiding yelling or raising your voice. This just does not help anyone see your point of view. Instead, it sends the message that only your words matter. Even if yelling intimidates the other person into giving up or agreeing, the underlying problem only grows worse. So if you need to, as mentioned, take a time out if things get too heated. In a perfect world, we would all follow these rules 100% of the time, but it just doesn't work like that. So if an argument starts to become personal or heated, take a time out. Agree on a time to come back and discuss the problem after everyone is cooled down. And finally, attempt to come to a compromise or an understanding. There isn't always a perfect answer to an argument. There's not always a perfect agreement. Life is just too messy for that. So do your best to come to a compromise, and this might mean some give and take from both sides. If you can't come to a compromise, simply taking the time to understand your partner's perspective can help soothe negative feelings. So these are our fair fighting rules. I encourage you to consider how you can incorporate these into your current communication style. Next, I want to take an additional moment to focus on coming to a compromise or an understanding piece. So that very last fair fighting rule from the previous slide. So here are some recommendations on relationship conflict resolution that involve a lot of the fair fighting rules previously discussed. These recommendations also come from Therapist Aid. So first is focus on the problem and not the person. If a disagreement turns to personal insults, raised voices, or mocking tones, the conversation is simply no longer productive. So be careful to focus on the problem without placing blame on the other person involved. If a disagreement becomes personal, you should probably pause the conversation. Next, use reflective listening. Oftentimes during arguments, we focus on getting our own point across rather than listening to the other person. So before responding to the other person, just restate what they have said to you in your own words. Continue this process until the other person agrees with what you understand. Next, share your side. The other person should reflect back your ideas in their own words until you too understand. Using this language will help both individuals feel listened to and understood, even if you disagree, and even if it takes a few iterations to get there. Now, one of these strategies that I discussed previously is the use of I statements, and this is a big one. So when sharing a concern, begin your sentence with I. For example, I feel hurt when you don't tell me you'll be late. With this sentence format, we show that we're taking responsibility for our own emotion rather than blaming the other person and assuming that they're wanting to have that impact on us. The alternative sentence, you never tell me when you're going to be late, will often cause the other person to become defensive. Again, as previously mentioned, but just as important each time around, is knowing when to take a break or take a time out. So anytime that you or the other person are becoming argumentative, insulting, or aggressive, it's probably a good time to take a break. Have a plan in place so you or the other person can call for a break when needed. So what would that look like? Talk about it together. Spend some time doing something alone that you find relaxing. So maybe it's watching a show or journaling or talking to a friend. And when you both calm down, you and the other person can return to solving the problem. But be sure that when you do return, it isn't a good idea to leave these issues unaddressed. So be sure that you return to the conversation at some point rather than avoid it entirely. And finally, work towards a resolution. Disagreement is a normal part of any relationship, personal or professional. If it becomes clear that you and the other person will not agree, focus on a resolution instead. So it might be trying to find a compromise that benefits both individuals. Ultimately, ask yourself if this disagreement really matters to your relationship, and let yourself move on if not. Now, each time I do one of these webinars, I like to talk about the topic in a more broad sense, right? Because we don't just operate in one space. We operate in lots of personal and professional relationships. So now that we've talked about different communication styles, the rules for fair fighting, and strategies towards relationship conflict resolution, I want to talk more about facts of communication that are unique to the adult entertainment industry. Consent. Consent is the foundation of the industry and ensures an ongoing dialogue that really just upholds safety and respect for all parties involved. Now, this can involve setting boundaries and ensuring mutual respect. But I want to provide some best practices for obtaining consent. Now, these practices are communication styles in and of themselves. Communication doesn't always have to be verbal. Sometimes it's in our body language, sometimes it's in the way that we interact with others. So some of these practices include an open dialogue. Always initiate conversations around boundaries and comfort levels before, during, and after any interaction. Do it frequently and do it early. Number 2 is ask for permission. So never assume that consent is in place. Instead, always ask explicitly. And again, this can be done multiple times throughout an engagement with someone. On that note, continuous check-ins. Remember that feelings and boundaries can evolve both personally and professionally. So regularly checking in to ensure ongoing comfort and agreement is important. Recognizing a right to withdraw. So understanding that consent can be withdrawn at any time. And as a result, any activity should stop immediately. Recognizing that just because someone consented to a behavior or a conversation or a relationship in the past doesn't mean that they automatically consent to that this time around. And finally, educate and update. So stay informed about industry standards and continuously educate yourself and others on the importance of consent in this space. Now, a topic that I am often discussing with folks in the adult entertainment industry is engaging with online audiences. So equally important for communication styles is how do we navigate and how do we engage with an online audience, which presents both opportunities and challenges. So what we know generally is that communicating directly with consumers is how we build a strong, loyal community of fans through that indirect engagement. Consumers ultimately like to feel as if they are unique customers and will receive some form of special treatment from you. Personal bonds create customer loyalty. But knowing all this, given the risk of inappropriate comments or requests, it's essential to approach these challenges head on with clarity and assertiveness. So here are some strategies that are recommended. Number one is setting clear guidelines. So this means setting and displaying clear community guidelines for your platform. So knowing the rules can deter potential negative interactions in the future. Communicate these guidelines in a very clear way. So maybe that's online, maybe that's on your website, maybe that's an initial consent or contracts that you provide to folks. Number two is the use of moderation tools. So using available tools and features that can filter or block unwanted comments, users, key terms, things like that. So this not only creates a safer environment for you, but also for your genuine followers that might see that content from others. Three, and I can't say this enough, is to set the clear boundaries. So when confronted with inappropriate requests, it's essential to respond directly. Sometimes this is challenging, right? Because what does it compromise for us? Does it compromise financial security? Does it compromise relationships? But when it's appropriate and when these comments are incessant or inappropriate, decline and reiterate your boundaries. And lastly, seek support. So engage with peer networks or platforms for advice and support when dealing with persistent issues in this space. All right, so some final takeaways from today's webinar about communication. Communication is both a tool and a symbol. It's how we engage with others and ask for what we need in both our personal and professional lives. That's the reason that we have conversations about communication and how we can approach it in a way that symbolizes trust, respect, and mutual understanding. When we communicate in healthy, assertive ways, that's how we maintain respect for all parties involved. Healthy communication also promotes safety, consent, and authenticity in our interaction, especially those that are unique to the adult entertainment industry. And finally, healthy communication should be the standard of the adult entertainment industry, given the dynamic and intimate nature of this work. Okay. Thank you for joining me, Dr. Tess Kilwei, during today's Pineapple Support webinar on radical value-based communication. Communication, the root of both interpersonal and occupational connection and conflict. This webinar explored effective communication styles that allow you to engage in value-based interactions with others, as well as tangible strategies to begin incorporating into your daily life. Today's webinar was sponsored by SegPay.